We are here. Let me just pin myself so you can see me for a second. We are here today with another Profiles in History. This is kind of a um, this is we decided that this is going to be a two-part program, by the end of this talk, I'll tell you what the date is of part two. They can be standalones, but I think doing a deeper dive, and I think Chuck would agree, doing a deeper dive. There was too much ground to cover, and there's some really interesting stories in this talk today, folks, because it's a local story that affected the whole country, but this is a very local story, and a lot of us are from this area, Paterson, and this is in our backyard. So we really want to give it it's justice. We want to give it the time it deserves. So I'm going to let my brother take it away, and he will explain more about how we're going to take this into two parts, and you'll learn about what you're going to learn today, and then we're going to wait on for the next time, which will be, we're going to try to get this next talk within the next 3 weeks so that all the details are still pretty fresh. All right. So thanks, Chuck. Thanks for coming. And there you were.
You bet. Thanks, Michelle. As always, it's great to be here, and I am happy to be sharing the story with you folks today. And as Michelle already pointed out, this is a slightly expanded version of what we originally anticipated. We were going to be trying to include a history of the labor movement along with the Paterson Silk Strike, and we decided to kind of separate out the life of Carlo Tresca, who is featured in the title, as you can see right there. He participates in both strikes we'll be going deeper into today, but his life extended so much beyond the strikes that we decided to give him a full go. And today we will meet him as we get further into the strikes, both in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and then the Paterson strike of 1913. But we're also going to start by giving you some backstory on the labor movement. This is the post-Civil War growth of our manufacturing industries, and it leads to increasing mechanization, increasing immigration to fill the needs of these machine shops and factories across the country. And of course, the inevitable strife and conflict that comes with the growth of industry, as we will find out today. So we see this lovely front piece Michelle found. This is a picture of Paterson, probably looking down from Garrett Mountain, I would assume. And this is a great overview to give us a start on our topic today. So we will go to the first strike we will encounter, and again, this is post-Civil War America. We have a great growth in the industrial era at this point, and it starts out with the first what's considered major strike in the country of workers, and this is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This is significant for multiple reasons. Of course, being the first large-scale strike in the country, it gained national attention for its kind of surprising upstart, and then its effect on all industry, going far past just the railroad workers. And also, this is the first strike that spread beyond the local area where it started. This strike is considered to have started Pittsburgh, West Virginia. Various locations decided to strike independently, and then with some coordination, a larger walkout began. And the strike got national attention because it became known as a sympathy strike, meaning that workers outside of the railroad industry who may or may not have been affected by the strike decided to step out as well and show sympathy for the strikers. And the scene we see here is a depiction of workers blocking railroad engines in Martinsburg, West Virginia. What was the result of this strike? Well, again, it brings national attention to the plight of wage earners and workers. This was an era where mostly the workers were simply trying to reduce their hours. They were often working 10 plus hours a day. They were not getting compensated for overtime, and this was simply an attempt to bring the workday down from 10 to 8 hours. This was one of the first attempts to do this via strike. And what it did was it brought the national government into the area of strike breaking. The Pennsylvania uh, uh, governor, I believe he was the one who first called President Rutherford B. Hayes at the White House to send the National Guard, which he did. Federal troops went to several sites to put down the insurrection. And again, this was not a particularly violent strike. There was violence. We did have incidents of injuries and death, but the numbers were not very high here. This was simply a kind of a panicked reaction to something that had never really been seen before, a mass walkout of workers. The strike lasts approximately 3 months. It does not lead to any particular gains for the strikers. They ended up going back to work pretty much under the same conditions. But one thing that came out of it, actually two things that came out of the strike. One I found interesting was the growth of the building of local armories around the country. The unrest and the uncertainty and the scary nature of some of the vehemence expressed by the strikers scared local authorities into appealing for funding to build stout armories. Probably this is the first concerted attempt to build basically fortresses throughout the country, probably since the days of the Native American uprisings in the 1700s. And a lot of these armories built at this time still exist to this day. Local outposts for the authorities to be able to store weapons as needed. And again, I was surprised to see this reference in this history, that this is literally the beginning of the armory movement in the country. This also leads to a growth in labor organizing. This is an unorganized strike. There are nascent organizations at this point trying to get labor together. This leads to the growth in a group known as the Knights of Labor. It's a very, very young group. I believe their following at this time was somewhere in the neighborhood of 70,000 national members. After this event, the growth of the Knights of Labor was significant, up to about 700,000. So again, the attention brought by the strike kind of begins the movement of labor trying to fight for better work conditions and better pay. Our next event on the next strike, we go to the year 1886, the event, the Haymarket Riot of Chicago. This happened in May of 1886, and this was an unfortunate activity. This was at the very end of a public speech which had gone peacefully by all accounts. Everyone attending up to this point noted how uneventful this speech was, this gathering was. The mayor of Chicago attended briefly and went home bored because nothing was happening, nothing incendiary, nothing radical, simply words being spoken. And this was a reaction to a strike the previous day at the International Harvester plant near Chicago, where I believe one worker was killed in a scuffle. So this was in direct response to that event. At this particular speech-making event, the people on the stand were calling for an 8-hour workday once again and safer working conditions. And just as about the last speaker had finished, at about 10:30 in the evening, a bomb was thrown randomly as the police were showing up to end the event, and the explosion killed one officer, injured several others, and basically turned upside down any positive activity that had come out of this event. And it became a long-standing trial in Chicago. I believe 8 of the participants were found guilty, 4 were hanged as a result. I believe 2 or 3 others were eventually exonerated by a future governor of Illinois. But what this thing did is this created another sympathy strike. This was a another national event. 300 to 500,000 workers walked out as a result of the Haymarket riot. And again, it's referred to as the Haymarket event, the Haymarket incident, Haymarket riot. It really wasn't a riot in a full sense because it was such a brief period of tumult. It was about a 5-minute period where guns were fired and after the explosion went off. And many of the gunshots were supposedly by police randomly shooting even other policemen. No official report came out on that end. But as I said, 4 were hanged as a result. And again, a lot of times the reaction by authorities to these events created more militantism, more calls for action, and more calls for police restraint. We will move along 5 years later to another very, very famous labor incident. This is the Homestead event of 1892. And again, it's a major strike at a steel plant in Pittsburgh or outside of Pittsburgh. And this is a bit of a different storyline here. This is a union that is a skilled workers union that were amongst the highest paid of all laborers in the country. They had won a previous strike back in the 1880s, and they received the compensation they asked for. That had been whittled down a little bit in the previous contract. But in 1892, their previous 3-year contract was about to run out. And the owners here at Homestead, and this would be Andrew Carnegie and his henchman, Mr. Henry Clay Frick, decided that these workers were making too much money. So instead of renewing the contract at any price, they basically canceled the contract and decided to bring in strikebreakers. Amongst the group of strikebreakers they brought in were a few hundred Pinkerton Guards. The Pinkerton Guards were a well-known group out of Chicago. A company founded by Allan Pinkerton in the 1850s was considered the first private eye company in the country. And going past detective work by the 1870s and 80s, they started to become heavily involved in infiltration of so-called radical groups in the labor movement. There were several infiltrators in the Homestead area by this time, but the actual violence occurred when the Pinkertons showed up on a boat about to unload and do their business, replacing the striking workers in Homestead. Upon departing the boat, they were attacked by the strikers. Much violence took place, death, destruction, and this was a very, very, very low moment for the labor movement in that they lost a lot of sympathy with general laborers in this attack on the Pinkertons, who were, basically there to just do a job just like the strikers were doing. However unseemly it seemed to the strikers, they lost a lot of sympathy with outside groups due to their attack on the Pinkertons. Another publicity failure was an attempted assassination on Henry Frick by a known anarchist by the name of Alexander Berkman. And this was a failed attempt by gun in the offices of the Homestead plant a few weeks after this event. And I believe this was September of 1892. So this was not a successful strike, given the events I just described. What was one result of this? The strike breakers brought in successfully. This is after the Pinkertons' lack of success. The strike breakers that were brought in successfully were mostly African Americans from the South, and this is considered the origin or close to the origin of the African American community of Pittsburgh, which remains strong to this day. This is kind of their foothold into the workings of Pittsburgh. Another very important publicity thing that came out of this Homestead event was a song that became a bestseller through the country entitled "Father Was Killed by the Pinkerton Men." A real, I'm sure, a real sad, angry ballad regarding the events that day in 1892. Our next labor event is one that I had never heard of. This is one from a little bit later in the same state of Pennsylvania. This is September of 1897, and this is known as the Latimer Massacre. And this is an event where we have about 100 or so parading workers. These are workers on strike from coal mines in the area. They are simply walking from their original location to the town of Latimer. You can see a photo of them in progress to Latimer. But before they got to town, they were met by a sheriff and a sheriff's posse, where at least 19 of them were shot dead. Mostly they were shot in the back. This was an event that caught the attention of the country. Unfortunately, the local sheriff was acquitted of all murder charges, claiming it was self-defense. He basically claimed that these people were trying to run me over. They were trying to walk over me, so I had to shoot them along with my posse. This was a very, very tragic event that was highlighted throughout the country at the time. And this was on top of other events of the period. One was known as the Twin Shaft Incident of the year prior, nearby in Pittston, Pennsylvania, where 58 miners died in a mine collapse, which was, again, another national story that created attention to the unsafe conditions in the mine. In fact, the one guy who got out at that Twin Shaft incident was fired because he left a mine that was collapsing. He left his post and thus was fired. Better than dying. The quote that comes out of this, one of the local papers had a quote: "May their death not be in vain. May they become the patron saints of the working people of America." And these mostly Slav and Polish immigrants certainly have mostly been forgotten, unfortunately, instead of being patron saints. Only recently in Pennsylvania have folks decided to commemorate this event with a plaque and a memorial service on the anniversary of this event. The people who perpetrated this massacre claim that the people shot were invaders from the steppes of Hungary who had come to America to destroy peace and liberty. Actually, they came to get a job, is really all they were doing. So we see the reaction of the mine owners, very callous. Again, the local police get off. And again, the result of these events are a growing labor movement. There's increased agitation. When defenseless miners were shot in the back, as they were in Latimer, this started to bring more and more people to the cause of labor. One of those people we'll meet next, his name was John Mitchell, a labor organizer for the United Mine Workers of America. Later, he became an organizer for the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. He was known as a tough negotiator and a very, very sympathetic leader. And it's because he knew what the workers were going through. This is a man who was orphaned at age 6 and immediately became a coal miner. So if you can imagine this man as a 6-year-old boy shoveling coal, you will understand where this man's concern and toughness came from. He was a fierce negotiator for labor, although he eschewed the more radical elements of the labor movement, meaning he didn't side with socialist, anarchists, or any of those types. He had a simple goal of boosting union membership, and he also had a goal of including all ethnicities in his labor organization, much to his credit. He unfortunately did not live a long life. He died of tuberculosis in his 40s while he was still a leading labor negotiator. And that's unfortunate, but a lot of his work was taken up by another organizer we'll meet. And she was friends with John Mitchell, and she takes up our next slide here. Her name, Mary Mother Jones. She started being known as Mother Jones a little bit later in her career, sometime in the 1890s. Prior to that, Mary Jones was a immigrant from Ireland who got married, had 4 kids, and was a seamstress. And when her 4 children and husband all died in 1867 as the result of a yellow fever epidemic in Chicago, she became a seamstress full time, opened a dress shop, which was wiped out in the 1871 fire of Chicago, the one that Mrs. O'Leary's cow started, if you recall. This directly led to her becoming a leading agitator in the labor movement. And let me tell you, this woman was about 5 feet tall, and most business leaders, most company men were scared to death of her because she was fearless and she was tough, and she looked at all of the miners, especially the children who were working, as her charges. These were her kids, and that's why they started calling her mother. She was charged in 1912 with a capital offense for contributing to a death by her speeches, which is the theme we'll see more of here later today. And again, she was charged with a capital offense by a military tribunal in West Virginia until it was thrown out by a judge who realized that you can't try a civilian by a military tribunal. She was also not involved in the women's suffrage movement. And here's her reasoning, quote, "I have never had a vote, and I have raised hell all over this country. You don't need a vote to raise hell. You need convictions and a voice," end quote. She was called the grandmother of all agitators. She was called the most dangerous woman in America, which she very well may have been. And she's also known for a 1903 March of the Kids. She gathered up 100 kids. These are not the sons and daughters of workers in the mines of Philadelphia in that area. These are the actual workers, the kids who are in the mines, just like John Mitchell, 6 to 15 years old, working full time. And she led them in a march from Philadelphia to New York City. And her particular goal was to visit the summer home of Theodore Roosevelt, who was then the president. And so she took them to Sagamore Hill in Long Island, and they were rebuffed by Teddy and his associates. But the point was made. She was shining a light on the horrible conditions that led children into the mines and worse. Another quote I'll read of hers, I can't resist. This is a quote she made a bit later, sometime around about 1910 or so. She writes, or she says, 50 years ago, the black babies were sold cash on delivery. Today, the white baby is sold to the manufacturer on the installment plan. He might die at his tasks, but the manufacturer with the automobile and the yacht and the daughter who talks French to a poodle dog, he can't pay $2 a day for these kids, end quote. So a lot of fun learning about this person. And again, she had a real serious concern regarding a very serious problem. The 1900 census shows that 1/6 of all US children under 16 years old were full-time employed. And in many cases, they were in the shops and the mines and in the most dangerous of conditions. So here's a woman who wasn't afraid to stand up to it, and she went to jail several times, to be sure, and she refused many offers of help. Again, her goal was very simple, and she even broke with John Mitchell, and her criticism of Mitchell was he became corrupted by power, meaning as the leader of an organization, he started doing things that he didn't necessarily start doing in his earlier activist career. So this is a woman who stayed true to her goals and wasn't tempted by any positions of power or money. She basically stayed to it well into her 90s. She was still active in the 1920s before passing away in 1930. So a shout out to Mother Jones. And we go to the next symbol, and this is a group that she was connected with loosely. This is the IWW, the International Workers of the World. And it's important to state what they were about. They were founded in 1905 in the city of Chicago, and they were mostly concerned with Western events regarding workers at that time. But their ultimate goal was something I've seen referred to as in the industrial labor movement, or it's also been referred to as syndicalism. And the syndicalist would be someone such as Mother Jones, who wanted to see one union for all. She saw the dangers, and others also saw the dangers of these separate unions popping up for specialized trades. And many organizers saw the problem being that these trade unions simply were looking out for their own tradesmen and not for the interest of other workers, despite the fact that many of these jobs were interrelated, particularly in textiles. Again, the railroad industry mostly all had interconnected jobs that should have brought the workers more closely together. And it was a group like this that took the forefront in trying to make it a reality. However distant a dream it seemed to be, even at the time, the more practical and say pragmatic of the labor leaders cast doubts on the ultimate goal of the International Workers of the World. They thought they were overreaching, trying to meld not only all types of workers, meaning different skill levels, but also different ethnic groups. Very important. I mentioned earlier John Mitchell being very skilled at seeing the need to weld together the different ethnic groups into one big group to have more clout. Well, the International Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies, you'll hear me mention that name a time or two going forward. Again, the Wobblies had that and more in mind. They wanted to fuse all ethnic groups, men and women. They wanted to protect the children. They would rather not have the children in the workforce at all. And again, all skills from the lowest, least skilled worker to the highest skilled tradesman. They wanted everyone in the same union. And we'll follow their story as we go. Next slide brings us to the first major strike that the Wobblies are involved with on the East Coast. They had been doing mostly West Coast work up until this time. They had had a small presence in Lawrence prior to the strike of 1912. Just before I get going in Lawrence, I wanted to do one little aside on what the Supreme Court was doing at around this time. There's a period in Supreme Court history from about 1905 to say 1935, so early on in FDR's first term. There's a 30-year period where the Supreme Court, despite some changes of members, had a kind of a mantra going, and the mantra basically said that contracts between workers and employers were inviolate, meaning that no state could make a law about hours, how many hours one could work. No state could take the side of a worker or an employer. Basically, it's between the employer and the employee, and there's no laws that can violate that. So this flawed, which is now seen as a flawed Supreme Court view, led to the 1905 decision known as Lochner versus New York, which basically struck down New York's child labor laws, trying to protect children in the workplace. And they did strike it down based on what I just said, the fact that in their views, the Due Process Clause it did not allow for states to interfere with the contract between a worker and an employer, no matter how vile the contract would be. So using that as a backdrop, we go forward into Lawrence. And the Lawrence, Massachusetts strike stands out for many, many reasons. Number one, like I said, it was the first IWW attempt on the East Coast to not only participate in, but basically run the strike. They were extremely well organized and they were prepared. This was not a spontaneous strike. What had happened in Massachusetts was something I had just mentioned. The state legislature decided to reduce by mandate the number of hours people can work from 56 hours to 54 hours, which both seem like very large numbers from our perspective today. The number of hours being reduced wasn't really the issue. What was the issue was when they went back to work in January after this new law took effect on January 1st, their first paycheck showed the 2 hours were not going to be compensated by the owners of the mill. Actually, there's one owner we're going to be talking about. So they immediately called for a strike. And part of that also was they weren't only required to work the 2 less hours, which you would think they'd be relatively happy about. They were required to speed up their work to make up for the lost 2 hours. So they were not only working harder, but they were working more dangerously in plants that were using a somewhat newfangled system as automation was increasing and ramping up production in the textile industry. And in particular, it was what they called the multiple loom system, where everyone had started out on a single loom. They were able now to run 2 looms and even up to 4 looms at once due to increased technology. So they were asking a person to get paid the same for working faster on multiple looms as they were getting paid to work at whatever rate they were working on the one loom. So it definitely was a pay decrease and an increase in danger for these workers. So a mass strike was called for in January after the first paychecks came out. And within days, everything was shut down in Lawrence. The strike became a national story. And we go to the next slide and we'll see another picture. The one we see is the bayonets versus the strikers. And here we see what they called the bread and roses strike. And that's what this entire strike was called. There was a sign at one of the strikes that said, "We want bread, but we want roses too." And so it became known as this. Here we see these are striking women in the streets of Lawrence. Again, in most of these textile industries, women and children were the dominant employees. In the case of Lawrence, I believe it was over 50% of the workers were women. So this was a family affair. We had mothers going out on strike, not bringing in the money. But what became an issue for these workers was the kids. Some of the kids were also working alongside mom and dad, and some were not and would need daycare while the strike was ongoing. So it became a thought of the strike organizers, who will meet shortly, to solicit groups of people in cities, not too far away, like New York and Boston. Another city was Barry, Vermont. They chose worker-friendly folks in those cities to host the kids for the period of the strike. So 2 shipments of kids were sent out with much fanfare and much press attention, which was the intent of the strike leaders. And when the kids arrived in New York City in particular, they were not only well received, but it became a major event. They were feted and partied around. They had events, they had fundraisers. It became increasingly an embarrassment to the authorities in Lawrence that this was happening right in front of their eyes. And we'll see what they did the third time they tried to send kids out of town. It was the beginning of the end for the mill owner, and that's who we'll meet next. There's basically just one man in charge of this entire group of mills, and it's William Madison Wood. A bit of an interesting character in his own right. He was the son of Portuguese immigrants. So talking about his immigrant workforce, here's a man who experienced his own versions of discrimination as a eventually wealthy Portuguese American. He was denied membership into certain exclusive clubs by his more white-skinned compatriots, which bothered him to a point, but he was wealthy enough to overcome that kind of prejudice. He is considered a bit of a Horatio Alger story, which is the old, pulling yourself up from the bootstrap story. He was a mill apprentice, made it to management, went into finance, did some banking, went into sales, was a paymaster for one of the mills, and eventually became the mill manager after marrying the daughter of one of the wealthiest mill owners, which always helps Horatio Alger stories. What he does, though, to his credit, is he consolidates by 1899 all of the mills, all 8 major functioning mills in Lawrence. He consolidates them to the one company, the American Manufacturing Company, and he becomes basically a monopolist in the process. They are, his company, the largest worsted wool producer in the world by the turn of the century, 1900. And he's considered by many at this time to be not a terrible owner. The wages aren't the worst in the country. There are some concessions that have been made prior, so he doesn't have a terrible reputation at this point. He decides, though, when the state legislature passes the bill I mentioned recently to reduce the hours from 56 to 54, he decides to make them work harder, and he will not pay for those missing 2 hours. And this, of course, directly leads to the strike. Now, what we see after a period of frustration, and we will see the stories coming up, 2 of the strike organizers are arrested after a woman is killed during a strike event. The woman killed, her name was Anna Lopizzo. She apparently was killed by police gunfire, according to a dozen or more witnesses. The police decide to ignore the evidence and to put the blame on 2 gentlemen who will meet shortly. And as a result of this, Wood decides that the outside agitators of the IWW, who are now in charge of the strike, they were brought in right away at the very beginning of the strike. There's only a few actual local organizers within Lawrence. Most of these people are coming in from New York, Boston, and elsewhere. He decides that it's time to put these people away. He knows there's not really solid charges. So this man paid 2 of his employees to plant dynamite in the areas of the labor organizers, where, of course, it was found, and where, of course, they had more goods on the labor organizers until well after the fact, after the strike ends, going into the next year. It is determined that he indeed was the person behind the dynamite planting. Now, no one was hurt. They were diffused, and eventually one person was charged. The person he paid $500 to do it was charged a minor fine is all he got. But Wood stood trial for this. It was well known that he did pay someone to plant the dynamite, and no surprise, he was acquitted, because any juror who's going to vote against William Wood in that era in Lawrence would not be working in Lawrence again. So again, intimidation plays a factor in the jury decision for William Wood's trial. But we will meet now the 2 people who were framed for the murder of Anna Lopizzo. On the left, we see Joe Caruso. He was not an organizer. He was simply a local yokel who was supposedly the trigger man, although it was proven during a trial he was eating spaghetti during the event, the killing of Lopizzo, and was eventually exonerated fully. The other 2 men you see in the middle, smiling Joe Ettore, age 26, and the Italian-born Arturo Giovannitti. These are the 2 men held for the murder of Anna Lopizzo. Mr. Ettore was by far the lead organizer up until the time of his arrest. at this Lawrence strike. Key to his success as an organizer was his very, very good-natured, smiling Joe reputation and his ability to speak 5+ languages. He can speak 5, he can understand more, and this made him a very effective organizer in doing one of the first things they did when they came in to set up the strike committees. Is he organized one committee for every ethnic group. So literally there were up to 20 different committees, which meant that all of the strike information was printed in 20 different languages with 20 different interpreters, so everyone can understand what everybody else was doing. And this is largely thanks to the very skilled Mr. Joe Ettore. Next to him, Mr. Giovannitti he was not a wobbly. He was not part of the IWW infrastructure. He was actually a member of the Italian Socialist Party. So he brought in more of the Italian concern to the Lawrence story. He, of course, spoke fluent Italian, and he was a poet, so he had more of the style and flair in giving his speeches. Ettore was more of a nuts and bolts guy. But between the two of them, they made an effective team, both as organizers and as a defense group here, because the two of them gained much sympathy from most of the strike's rank and file. They were both very popular, and they both did a very wonderful job in setting up the infrastructure, which allowed the strike to proceed rather smoothly. And what we learned as a result of this strike is that the strike is considered successful. Now, there's one particular reason the strike was ended quickly and was settled in favor of the workers, and it has to do with the third attempt to send children out of Lawrence to New York City. This attempt was going to be squashed by the police force and by the powers that be because they didn't want another embarrassing parade of kids marching down New York City. So they went to the train station as the train was departing and started clubbing mothers and their children in order to control them from leaving town on the train. So it was a beat down to keep them from leaving town, which to me I found kind of odd. And at the same time, this was exactly the kind of publicity that the strikers needed, because this was the beginning of the end of the strike, which was settled favorably for the strikers. What happened as a result of the beatdown at the train station? It got national attention, including the attention of the wife of the president, and that would be Helen Herron Taft, the wife of William Howard Taft, who was in his lame duck months in late 1912. But he decided, actually, through her, he decided to call for a congressional investigation. And the congressional investigation ended up moving along the strike negotiations, and it ended up being settled within 2 months. And I'll just read, again, this is a popular poem of the time to highlight the children and their parade and the effect on the strike. Was it an army's martial tread that beat through the traffic's sullen roar? And was it the shouting of warriors' dread that the icy blasts of north wind bore? Nay, 'twas but the patter of little feet and children's voices clear and sweet. Loud ring their call o'er the city's din, we are the strikers and we shall win. And win they did. Strike ended in March, but it wasn't quite over, because the men you're looking at right now, outside of Caruso on the left, Joe in the middle, and Arturo on the right, were held in jail for this murder that they did not commit. And they were held well past the strike's end in March of 1912. So what happened at this point is the IWW had to bring in some outside help. And they had already had the help of this next person. She was on the scene. Her name is Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. We'll meet her again in Paterson coming up shortly. But at the time, again, she was, if we can get to the next slide, at the time, she was considered a kind of a wonder child of the labor movement. She was called cool. She had cool intelligence behind her fiery oratory, just eloquence and sweetness. If we can get to the next slide, we can actually see her as well. She was raised in the Bronx, although she was born in New Hampshire. And there's a very important story I want to share with you at the end about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and the state of New Hampshire. Very important story. I'll get to that at the end. But in the meantime, she was raised by socialists, so she was raised in a political atmosphere. She was booted out of high school for her activism, and her first speech was at age 15, right before she was kicked out of high school. And the speech title was "What Socialism Will Do for Women," and it was given at the Harlem Socialist Club. She became a self-described professional revolutionary, an agitator against the injustices of capitalism, racism, and misogyny. Another quote from Elizabeth Gurley Flynn: "I am with the downtrodden every time, and I am able to show these people a way out of the difficulties. Is it any wonder they stick to me?" End quote. So again, this is a powerful force of the labor movement. She organizes a lot of the women's meetings in Lawrence and then again in Paterson, as we will see. And she is also pretty much required to pick up where Ettore and Giovannitti left off as they were languishing in jail. So she becomes one of the major organizers of the strike, along with the next gentleman, who is a kind of a famous figure in the labor circles. His name is Bill Haywood, also known as Big Bill. He was a son of a Pony Express rider born in Salt Lake City, Utah, actually Utah Territory in 1869. He was, again, in the mines, working at a very young age. He worked in lumber camps. He worked in the Northwest mostly, and became attracted to the labor movement in the late 1890s. He joined the Western Federation of Miners, and shortly thereafter, in 1905, I believe actually 1906, he was accused of murdering the former governor of Idaho, and stood trial where he was acquitted and became a national figure in the labor movement at that time. Just to give you a quote or two from Mr. Haywood, here's a quote: "The worst thief is the one who steals playtime from children." Another quote: "The capitalist has no heart, but harpoon him in the pocketbook and you will draw blood." End quote. So these are words of a industrial unionist, someone who not only believed in what the IWW was offering, but worked extremely hard to try to make it happen. This is a man of hope, a bit of a dreamer, and yet was a relentless fighter for the rights of the labor class. Another quote by Bill Haywood: "The capitalist class have no country, no flag, no patriotism, no honor, and no God but gold. Their emblem is the dollar mark, the ensign, the skull and crossbones for women and little children. Their symbol, the black flag of commercial piracy, and their password is graft." End quote. So here's a powerful figure that most authorities hated, absolutely despised, and he was under indictment. At one point, he had to be held in Boston because if he showed up in Lawrence again, he was going to be arrested for misappropriating strike funds, which really had nothing to do with authorities. The funds were for the strikers to do what they wanted. No striker pressed those charges. That was simply another contrived charge by the authorities in Lawrence. So again, this is a large task that Haywood is up against. And of course, Haywood is on shaky ground in Lawrence at this time. So they have to call in some more help. And at this time, remember, the strike is over, but Ettore and Giovannitti are in jail. So this is when we introduce a man who earned the nickname the Bull of Lawrence after his appearance. And here's Carlo Tresca. The long-awaited Mr. Tresca has finally arrived in Lawrence. Next slide, please. So Carlo's called in at this point because he is a very good, what they call a middle guy, a fixer, someone who knows how to talk to the right people to get things done. He's a immigrant from Italy, born in 1879. He's in this country shortly after the turn of the century, and he becomes a very, very well-known agitator. At the beginning, he's mostly agitating against the Catholic Church. He buys a newspaper to run out of first Philadelphia and then Pittsburgh, and his main focus of attack is the Catholic Church. And we'll meet him in much more depth next time. But at this point in time, he's just ending a sentence in the Allegheny County Jail near Pittsburgh. And he knows what's going on in Lawrence. He's stuck in jail during the beginning of the strike, but he feels compelled to go there, and he happens to be called there because at this point he's starting to be known in the labor movement as someone who can effectively talk to especially Italian Americans. His English is very poor at this point. It's passable, but weak, but his passion is strong and his skills as an orator are needed for a particular reason in Lawrence. So he shows up on, I believe, May Day in Lawrence. This is 1912 still, with Ettore and Giovannitti in jail. And his goal at this point is to make sure the workers don't forget about their two friends in jail, the two organizers. So he continues to raise awareness about the impending trial. He wants to keep the agitators kind of alive, even though the strikers are relatively happy with the settlement. They're home and they're working and they've got their concessions. So this is a tricky point for Carlo because he's trying to keep the spirit alive while at the same time recognizing that the workers are satisfied enough to not raise more of a fuss. What he does, multiple ideas here, but one thing he does is he decides to organize a funeral procession for the late Anna Lipizzo, who's now already months buried, but she never had a proper funeral. So he creates a funeral procession, several thousand people marching through Lawrence, quasi-legal. He does it again a few weeks later, and at this point, the police chief goes to him and he's like, Carlo, are you going to have a funeral session every week? I mean, there's no one new is dying here. Like, you can't keep doing this. But again, it was kind of friendly, kind of, repartee between Carlo and law enforcement at the time. And again, Carlo's main goal is to not let the people forget that there's two people in jail waiting for a trial. Eventually, the trial does happen in November. So this is many, many months after the strike ended. And finally, Ettore and Giovannitti are acquitted with much fanfare. And Tresca is seen as a key member of the team that got to see these two released. He was not involved in any of the legal defense. But again, one thing he did behind the scenes was he was good at convincing people that they might not want to testify against these two people. And if you don't testify, then we're going to end the boycott on your store. So again, economic leverage was used within the Italian American community because these two defendants needed respectable Italians to step up and say they were good people. They did not commit this murder. They were here. They were there. There were too many labor folks who were defending them, but not enough in the respectable part of the Italian American community, which Tresca was able to bridge a gap with and help achieve the release of these two prisoners. This is also where Carlo met Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and they begin a 12-year relationship at this point. It's kind of on the down low at first because Carlo is married. His wife's back in Pennsylvania. They end up separating, filing for divorce, but on a technicality, were never actually divorced. So Carlo remains married to his first wife throughout his life, despite the fact that he had many, many other partners through that period. This is the style of Carlo. He enjoyed his activism as much as he did his socializing. and it creates the myth and the legend that we're going to learn more about. So we take the story one more step, and this is part of the organization team that Carlo did, Lawrence. They created strike posters. They were wanting to threaten the city that if these two men were indicted, if they were going to be charged with murder and convicted, your whole city is going to shut down again. And again, the spirit of Lincoln, you can see on that poster, is brought up in that they're just talking about freedom and liberty. And anytime you mention those words, Lincoln generally gets thrown into the mix. But this was a threat that unless they're either released or the indictment is removed, there will be another strike. And the reason this was effective is because, again, this was a single owner town. All of the mills owned by one entity means that they did have leverage. The workers had leverage here. This is not the story when we move south to the state of New Jersey in Paterson, which is our next stop on the labor train. So we move ahead to the following year. Paterson, this might still be 1912. There's an overview coming up. Next slide, please. I think we're going to see a view kind of like our front piece that had the falls. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, well, anyway, we can do a little backdrop on Paterson while we're waiting for the next slide, please. The city of Paterson, there it is, 1912. So the same year as the Lawrence strike. This is, again, looking from, I'm sure, Garrett Mountain down the hill. You can see the rail line in the foreground. And again, this was a perfectly situated city for silk mills. And the history here industrially goes back to the 1790s and Alexander Hamilton, of course, with the Great Falls of Paterson. But Paterson at this point, especially the silk industry, the textile industry, didn't necessarily view the falls as other manufacturers may have. For many folks, the falls were a source of energy, a source of power. For most of the silk manufacturers, though, in Paterson, this was a source of clean water, which was extremely important in the silk manufacturing process. Raw silk had to be washed multiple times to increase its luster, and thus the fresh water from the Passaic River, and it was fresh back then, pre-industrial for the most part, you were getting clean water, and this water was vital for the silk industry in Paterson. So that does explain a little bit about why we see this town grow as a mill town through the 1830s. The original mills show up in about the 1830s. There was a very small strike at that time. By the turn of the century, there were approximately 20 to 30 mills running in Paterson. But the key, I think, and the difference between Paterson and Lawrence is that they were not owned by one gentleman or one entity. All of Paterson mills had their own ownership. So when the strike occurred here in Paterson, the difference was the workers' leverage was much less because you were not dealing with one single owner. You were dealing with 30 different owners. They didn't all get along. A lot of the owners were happy to see other ones go out of business. They were often scarfing up the other ones when they were in financial trouble. So there was always this kind of edgy turmoil amongst mill owners. They never acted as a unit anyway. So this impending strike that takes place in 1913 ended up going a lot differently for that and some other reasons we will find out. Next slide, please. It'll show downtown, I believe. Again, a bustling, booming town in 1912. Again, an established workforce. It was a known location for immigrants to move in. We saw a great influx of immigration in this area in the 1870s and 80s. And again, a lot of these families who were employed by the mills simply had extended families join them. Often daughters, sons, nephews, cousins were all connected through working at one or multiple of these mills in town. And again, there were many, many jobs within the mills. There were some skilled, mostly unskilled labor at this point. And again, technology is starting to play a big role in these jobs in Paterson. For example, for years, I had mentioned earlier, talking about the single loom was the primary instrument in the mills. When they went to a double loom and even a quad loom, I guess is what it was called, they were literally quadrupling production, but they weren't quadrupling the workforce. So again, more work for the same pay meant less pay per hour for these people. And so we saw how this at this period we saw technology really kind of catching up and becoming a bit of a player in the employment scene in Paterson. We'll see the next slide, the exterior of the mill section of Paterson, which was of course located near the river, and of course also located by the train tracks. And we can see right here a busy city. I mean, this, like I said, 30 mills all running. And the other factor in Paterson regarding the silk mills that played a difference in the strike was the fact that many of these mill owners had subsidiary mills in Pennsylvania. So when strikes were threatened here, the Paterson owners can simply ramp up production in Pennsylvania and not miss a beat regarding orders. So again, much less leverage going into a strike here, just with that fact alone. The fact that you couldn't shut down the mills and shut down production. You can shut the mills, but the production is going to be coming from Pennsylvania. Now, that wasn't ideal in many ways for the owners because they had to spend more in shipping. It was made up somewhat by paying a lower wage in Pennsylvania because they had a higher number of children and women working in the Pennsylvania mills. But at the same time, it kind of undermined the clout that these workers may have had going into the strike. And we're going to see another view from inside of a mill, I believe. This is the interior of a mill. You can see the raw wool off on the right. This looks like either a dyeing shop or perhaps this is the washing area because you can see the big piles of the raw silk. You can see these are not children or well, there might be a woman in the backdrop there, but these are mostly immigrant men working in the mills, mostly Irish and Italian, some German, Poles, Slavs. They were all represented in varying numbers in these mills. So it was a full hodgepodge of ethnic mixing. And in many cases, they were not very much interconnected. These ethnic groups stayed to themselves, spoke their own languages, and did not have a common cause until perhaps the strike came along. That came along in February of 1913. And the reason for the Paterson strike is it's very similar to the other strikes. There was no precipitating direct cause, but it was a walkout in February, late February of 1913. I believe the workers were emboldened by the success of the Lawrence strike, and right away the IWW shows up as the organizers. On the scene from the beginning here, we have Mr. Tresca, we have Flynn, we have Mr. Haywood. Those are the big three. And then we have Patrick Quinlan joining the group. He's an Irish-born organizer and labor leader. And another local by the name of Adolf Lessig, who we'll meet briefly coming up. Here's a street scene from the early part of the strike. What happened immediately in Paterson was a police clampdown of monumental proportions from day one of the strike. So this is not exactly how things went in Massachusetts. Massachusetts let things go on a little bit before they went after Ettore and Giovannitti. In this case, they went after the leadership of the IWW, they meaning the Paterson police force, immediately. So while a speech was being given, Patrick Quinlan was walking into the room, and Tresca and Flynn were nowhere near the speech, and all three were arrested for giving inflammatory speeches, trying to incite riots. Mr. Quinlan, again, wasn't in the building yet. He was on his way to the scene. and repeatedly said, how could I have spoken? I didn't even get a chance to walk in the building before I was arrested. So we'll see, they start right away with mass arrests at the top. And what happens with the leadership, they're basically in and out of jail. They're released on $1,000 bail, then they're rearrested on trumped up charges shortly thereafter. The bail goes up. Then a judge overthrows their arrest because it was completely fabricated, and so on. We see the back and forth between leadership of Paterson, and this includes the mayor, this includes the police force, this includes the newspapers. There's a mill owner who also owns the main newspaper, the Paterson Call. So right away, the empathy publicly is not with the strikers. Everything publicly in the media locally was very, very against the strikers and very, very much for the mill owners. And this is, again, because they controlled the media at the time. The only truthful reporting at this time comes from very, very marginal left-wing papers and magazines that were sending reporters to the scene to get what they would hope was the real story behind what was going on. So again, much tumult in the streets, mass arrests. This is a huge difference between the Lawrence strike and the Paterson strike. The Lawrence strike saw about 250 arrests with a few dozen people convicted. The Paterson strike, 4,800 arrests out of 25,000 strikers. So that's like 1/5 of all the strikers, 20% of 5,000 almost arrested, with another 1,500 or so convicted, not simply arrested. These are people who spent time in jail or had to pay fines to be released. So this is a massively different approach by the Paterson law enforcement team, in conjunction with the mayor, in conjunction with local prosecutors, in conjunction with most local judges. So we go to the next scene, and we're going to see the big five. These are the five perpetrators of the Paterson strike. So this is the IWW organizational team, left to right. It's Patrick Quinlan, the only one who spends significant time in jail is Mr. Quinlan, and we'll hear his story shortly. There's Carlo next to the lovely Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and the balding man between Flynn and Mr. Haywood is a man named Adolf Lessig. He was the local treasurer, I believe would be the best way to put it, for the IWW, and also a socialist activist in Paterson. He's the only true local of the story. He's a Paterson guy who dies in Paterson at his stationery store decades after this event. But again, a key figure, much more soft-spoken and much more a behind-the-scenes guy. He wasn't giving fiery speeches like the other four were. But again, an important part of the story because he's arrested like the rest of them. So we'll meet the police in our next photo. This photo is entitled "On the Job at the Haledon Line," and these are 5 Paterson police officers holding their billy clubs, and you see a mounted policeman in the background. They would literally, this is what the Paterson police were ordered to do by their police chief, Mr. John Bimpson, who we'll meet next. Mr. Bimpson told they should go to the county line and they should wait for the strikers to retreat to, there's Mr. Bimpson in the middle. They should wait for the strikers to retreat to the town of Haledon. What had developed during this strike is that Paterson not only cracked down heavily and arrested thousands of people, they also shut down all public buildings. So strike was set to be organized out of a place called Turn Hall. There were other auditoriums and halls that were available and rentable, but the police banned all such activity. So the only place where large groups of people could meet without being arrested was in the neighboring town of Haledon. It was at the time run by a socialist mayor who welcomed the crowds to Haledon, and they found a welcome host who we'll meet shortly, the folks who ran the Botto house, the Botto family. So basically the cops who we saw in the last shot were waiting to arrest people as they were leaving town. And this is under the orders of Chief John Bimson. So literally, when it came down to trial time, the one judge who was sympathetic to the strikers, challenged the police frequently about this activity. So he said, "So you arrested them for walking? Why?" And they said, "Well, they were walking out of town. They don't live in that direction. They're all staying in the other direction." And the judge said, "So if I was walking towards Helden, I'd be arrested?" Then they said, "Well, they were making noise." And then the judge said, "Well, the Salvation Army makes noise. Do you arrest them?" And then they said, "But it was on a Sunday." And then the judge said, "Well, if St. Patty's Day falls on a Sunday, there's plenty of loud noises and nobody gets arrested." So basically, the one judge who we will meet was the only one standing up for common sense and justice in this whole storyline. And the socialist press definitely took note of that judge, but no local papers did. Here we see the Botto House. This is the house in Helden that still stands today as the American Labor Museum, very rightfully so. And this is the grounds of the property. Up to 15,000 people allegedly squeezed onto these grounds to hear speakers every Sunday during the strike, which went from late February 1913 into July of 1913. So what happened at this house, they would gather in the morning, and Maria Botto, the matriarch of the family, would start cooking. Oftentimes it was pasta, and oftentimes she was feeding literally thousands of people from her kitchen. She had plenty of help. Her husband, Pietro, was a specialist in the mill industry. He was a weaver along with one of his daughters, and they both, the Botto family in total, all participated with the striking laborers and became known as the hosts of the agitators. As a result, the Bottos didn't fare well. Maria Botto died shortly after 1913, supposedly exhausted with her efforts from the labor strike. And Mr. Botto was banned from the mills, as well as his daughter. So they lost their professions as a result of their participation in the strike, because memories don't fade when it comes to this story, at least not personal memories. Collectively, we've had a hard time, I think, with the story, but apparently the city of Paterson and the mill owners didn't forget. The next photo will show the Botto House in its entirety. There's the building, which still stands. The balcony you can see in the upper part of the house was used as the speaking platform, and many famous labor leaders and socialists, leftists of all types, came and gave their speeches from that balcony. And we have visited the house. It does a wonderful job in preserving the memory of the story. It might be the one place left standing that really does a good job in telling the story. And I know that's not counting the Paterson Museum, which I haven't been to, but many of you have. And I've been told they've started to take this story a bit more seriously, I hope. So our next view will be of one of the outside agitators who came in to report on the story. This is John Reed, a journalist from Oregon. Reed College today, one of the leading liberal colleges of the West Coast, is named after him. He became an avowed communist after this period of time, but at the time, I think he would be more identified as a socialist, and showed up in Paterson. This is in April, so kind of in the middle of the strike. He shows up to report on the strike for a magazine out of New York, and is promptly arrested and thrown in jail with Carlo Tresca, who periodically was in and out of jail during this entire time. Tresca looks at Reed as a plant by the police and refuses to talk to him until he's introduced to Reed by a mutual friend, and then he becomes a confidant, and Reed gets a lot of the details of the story from Carlo in jail. Reed goes on to be the one of the outside vocal agitators in favor of the laborers, and his idea is believed to come up with a fundraiser, some sort of way that the New York City elite, some of the Greenwich Village artists and such, can show their appreciation for the labor strikers by throwing a pageant. And this is the brainchild of John Reed and his friend Abel Dodge. And they decide to rent Madison Square Garden. This is an event that takes place in June. And they hire professional set designers. They use volunteers, and they really do turn Madison Square Garden into a mini Paterson. That was their goal. They wanted to recreate the events of Paterson. There was one murder in Paterson. It was an accidental shooting of a man on his porch who was just watching events outside of his house, and of course, the labor leaders made a big fuss about that, and this was shown in this pageant. And here you see the poster that was prominently displayed throughout the New York, New Jersey area in the weeks leading up to this event. This was June 7th, much hyped, and it came off as a very, very successful production that simply lost money. So the purpose of it, which was to raise money for the increasingly beleaguered strikers, was starting to fail, and thus it was considered a failure. Ms. Flynn did not approve of this at all. She thought it was a distraction and a misappropriation of funds and such. But again, the heart was definitely in the right place. And there is actually a transcript of this entire pageant, which I haven't looked at yet, but would be interesting to take a look at. So our next slide shows us probably the biggest victim of this entire strike. His name is Patrick Quinlan. He went to jail for 2 years, the only convicted person in this entire strike. For some reason, the judge that exonerated many of the others was not the person hearing his case. So he was sentenced to 2 to 7 years of hard labor for a charge of inciting violence, and it's an event that he was not even at. Many people in his trial came to prove he was not even there. In fact, they identified the Italian speaker who said these things that were attributed to Mr. Quinlan. And again, an Italian with his accent versus Patrick Quinlan with his Irish brogue. Really hard to mistake the two unless you're trying to frame somebody, which they were trying to do and which they successfully did. Quinlan goes to jail for 2 years. He's released, I believe it was 1907. I believe this is his being released from jail, this photo. And it leads to an investigation of the New Jersey prison system. So Quinlan's eloquence and his writing from jail, highlighting the hard conditions, actually lead to prison reform of some sort after this. So that's where I think Mr. Quinlan's legacy lies. But again, going back to the Big Five photo I showed earlier, you had an Irishman, Irish-born Quinlan, Italian-born Carlo Tresca. You had the New England-born, Bronx-raised socialist Elizabeth Flynn, and she was involved with mostly the women's movement with the strike. You had the local German-born Adolf Lessig, and you also had Big Bill Haywood, born in the West, all coming together in Paterson for the aid of the workers. So it really was a multifaceted, multicultural strike team that ran the show in Paterson. Unfortunately, though, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, the Paterson owners were not consolidated. They were individual owners, and they had their backups in Pennsylvania. So they kept production going during the shutdowns. So the Paterson strike was a loser. The strike ended in July after 4 months. The strikers got 0 concessions, and simply what was left behind was a feeling of bad taste. And it's almost like the strikers didn't want to talk about it again. This was not a big part of Paterson's history. It was hard to get some of the older citizens to talk about their participation, even 4, 5, 6 decades after the fact. But we do have one quote I'd like to share. This is from one of the workers interviewed in the 1970s, I believe, when she was 77 years old. She was 17 at the time. Her quotes are, "Haywood, that voice, he filled the whole hall with his voice. And Girlie Flynn, she was beautiful. Tresca, so good looking, so nice. We were all in love with them. Beautiful people. They were so wonderful. They gave us hope. They just made us feel as if we were going to change the world." End quote. And that is, I think, a true sentiment after 60 years of repressing, because again, to say these things after a losing cause was, I think, almost an embarrassment to the people of Passaic or Paterson and the county in general. And the next person we're going to meet is another glimmer of hope in this whole story. This is the judge who, next slide, please, who actually sided with the strikers. He's the only one who did. His name, Judge James F. Minturn. He was an associate justice of the Supreme Court in New Jersey. And I would like to read a quote by him. He's the one who mocked the prosecution about arresting people for walking, basically. And this is his quote, and this is regarding the conviction of Patrick Quinlan, which he completely disagreed with. He said, Patrick Quinlan was convicted of, quote, the social sin of entertaining an ostracized economic faith which labored for the abolition of the present wage system, end quote. He's the only judge who called for an outside jury, realizing that the local citizens were prejudiced many times against the strikers because of the local press. He saw the way things were developing. He tried to influence the case as strongly as he could. He's also a justice who in later years openly chastised local prosecutors and defense attorneys for not including women on the jury as much as they should be. This is after suffrage in 1919. So again, an honorable judge in kind of an ugly story. There was kind of a bit of a needle in the haystack. And again, to conclude the story, the Paterson strike was a failure. This again pretty much ended the IWW efforts in the East. They focused more on Western events and eventually dissolved not long after. And again, a lot of the labor movement at this time was kind of polarized, and a lot of the polarizing was between the direct action activists, of which Carlo and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn would be part of, Bill Haywood. They didn't believe that we can get change through the ballot box. They believed in direct action, which is strikes, which is boycotts, and such. The political action folks, they were the socialists, they were the communists. They thought new change for the better can be voted in through the ballot box. So you saw a lot of clashing between the direct action activists and the political action activists. And again, we see some clear signs that like all other movements, the labor movement was not going to be presenting one voice in the labor struggle. They had different agendas. The whole concept of Carlo, who was an avowed atheist, and he called himself an anarchist. We'll go to the next slide, and we'll show another Carlo shot. These were scary people to most folks. Carlo, as captivating a speaker as he was, as charismatic as he was, he's there next to Bill Haywood, who's on the left center, and Carlo's just right of center there. People who went down the street with banners that said "No God, no Master" were and I believe still are threats to many people in society. So it's really no wonder that the radicalism of Carlo didn't really settle in with many folks. They found him a little bit over the top. One person said he never learned how to use a pen. He was always using the hammer, which was the name of one of his Italian language newspapers, Il Martello, which is the hammer in Italian. He was a hammerer, but at the same time, he was an idealist. And as he referred to himself, he was the least sectarian of the revolutionaries, which means that he didn't really side with one group, whether it be the Wobblies, whether it be the socialists. He went from socialist to the communist camp and then backed away from both. And as we'll see in the next presentation, he became a leader of the anti-fascist movement, as well as the anti-communist movement, as well as an anti-mafia activist. I mean, this guy was all over the map, but consistent in his opposing what he found oppressive regimes of any kind. So that's where we'll leave it from the Paterson story. I'll just finish up with one more kind of conclusion. And again, this is comparing the two strikes in Lawrence and Paterson. They often are lumped together in the same category because they were both run by the IWW on the East Coast, which they didn't do very much at all. And again, the difference in results seems to be the one owner versus 30 owners, which meant that the Paterson strike broke down quicker by certain shops going back to work, defying the strikers, defying the strike organizers. Because again, after 3 months, relief was hard to come by. The pageant brought no money, and these people literally had to get back to work. I think a lot of the more pragmatic labor organizers understood this, but the more idealistic, like Tresca, had a hard time with that. They felt that had they stuck to their guns and stayed on strike, that the strike could have been won. I don't necessarily agree with that. I do think that the clout held by the Paterson owners, particularly with their continuing to run mills in Pennsylvania during the strike, undermined the efforts in a large way. But one of the most disappointing aspects of the story, easily, is the overkill by law enforcement in Paterson. Trying to do research on this topic, it's very, very difficult to find the Paterson police perspective on this story because there basically is none, at least none that I can find. And that could simply be because of embarrassment. You would think that, having helped the mill owners win, that they would have been championed. This actually did happen in Lawrence, very strangely, right around the time of the first Ettore Giovannitti parades. These were the parades led by Carlo, trying to bring attention to the two guys still in jail. The citizens of Lawrence countered that parade with a God and Country parade to combat the No God, No Master parade. And the God and Country parade continued annually for decades in Lawrence. So Lawrence chose to forget the labor strike also, and they chose to champion the patriotic and the fictitious kind of version of the story. Only in the 70s and 80s did Lawrence come around to realize how important the strike was for the labor movement. And now they've fully embraced the story, and Lawrence is full of sites. The mill itself, the main mill that was the source of the strike, is now a condo with a plaque out front. So Lawrence has embraced this. Unlike Paterson, which I think there was just less to embrace in Paterson. The mills themselves were pretty much run out of business by the 30s and 40s with the advent of rayon and other synthetic fibers. So unfortunately, outside the Botto House and a small segment of labor historians, the Paterson story, because it was not successful, perhaps, does get the short shrift in the historical annals. However, to me, it was a story of glorious struggle at a time when we really didn't know where things were going regarding the labor movement. Many people thought Carlo's ideas were viable, meaning that workers can own everything, and it could be a worker class running the machinery, not capitalists. Unfortunately, of course, outside of co-op movements, this has not been the case, and we're faced today with a lot of these similar problems with immigration issues. Who's willing to do the dirtiest work for the lowest amount of money? We're talking about monopolies, just the use of law enforcement for private use, which we see in all of the stories I've mentioned today. Again, the stories really don't go away; they just kind of recycle. And I'm hoping that this presentation today helps a bit with the understanding of the Paterson strike. And I'd like to mention one more person from the Paterson strike who I did not get to include in today's photo lineup. Her name was Hannah Silverman, 17-year-old mill worker from Paterson, who was called the Joan of Arc of Paterson for her fiery speeches and her incendiary language in defense of the laborers and the labor movement. So just a shout out to Hannah and her memory. And again, we'll pick up part two, more of an overview of Carlo than a continuation of this particular story, because Carlo goes beyond labor strikes and he goes international in his vehement protests of things unjust. And we're going to learn his story next time. And I thank you for joining me today. And if anyone has anything to comment or question, I'd be happy to listen.
Yeah, we're just going to we have to really move it along. I have to end this call very shortly. So if you have any quick comments you want to make, that'd be great. But I am going to have to, we're going to have to move on. I just want to tell you that we do have, I did have a couple questions in the chat I just wanted to mention. And also we are going to pick this up on May 20th. Unfortunately, Chuck, I can't find another spot. If I can find another spot, I will look for a different day besides Monday. Monday's 3 o'clock, kind of our groove here. But if I can find another spot earlier, I'll look for that. But right now I have you scheduled for May 20th at 3 o'clock. So that's what we have right now. I did want to just acknowledge, we did get a couple questions in the chat. Which I can't seem to find. Here they are. Somebody said, I can't seem to find them now, but somebody asked a question very early on. So whoever that was, I can't seem to get it back. But if you wanted to ask your question again, that person, I have the closed caption on here, and it's kind of blocking anything that I see. But does anybody have a question that they wanted to ask? All right. And Chuck, did you want to mention I know the Bottle House is closed right now, but you can typically you're able to visit. This is a museum, right? Did you mention that?
Yes. The hours, at least the last I saw, the hours were Wednesday through Saturday, 1 to 4. Every afternoon, Wednesday, Saturday, 1 to 4. I believe those are current hours. Pretty sure. There are events there as well. There's children's events, there's art events, there's a lot going on there.
Right, but right now they're I think you said there was a fire there, right?
No, that's the Paterson Museum. The Bottle House is open. The Paterson Museum is closed to the public right now.
Oh! I thought you meant the Bottle House was closed.
No. Paterson Museum.
Yep. Got it. Okay, all right.
Yep.
Glad we went there last year then.
Yep.
See, we got to
It'll
see
reopen. It's minor damage. It will reopen in a few months, they said. Minor water damage.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming, and hope to see you on the 20th for more on this topic.